They say the people who love you the most are the ones who would never let you fall. They say blood is thicker than water, that family is the one constant in a world full of uncertainty, and that no matter how hard life gets, the people sitting at your dinner table on Sunday afternoons would never be the ones to betray you. I believed that with everything I had. I believed it through my 40s, through my 60s, through the years I buried friends and watched neighbors move away. I believed it even when the small signs started showing up, the kind of signs that your heart refuses to read because accepting them would mean accepting that your whole understanding of love had been wrong. My name is Eleanor, and I am 94 years old. I have watched this world change in ways I never could have predicted. I have outlived a husband, a sister, 2 close friends, and every single illusion I ever carried about the people I raised with my own hands. What I am about to tell you is not a story I share for sympathy. I share it because somewhere right now, there is a woman in her 70s sitting in her living room wondering why her bank account looks the way it does, and why her daughter has been offering to handle her bills for the last 6 months, and why something in the back of her mind keeps whispering that something is not right. I want her to hear me before it is too late. I was not always the kind of woman who lived alone with her thoughts and her garden. For most of my life, I was the center of things. I cooked for 12 people at Christmas and meant every minute of it. I drove my grandchildren to their appointments, helped my son navigate the paperwork after his first home purchase, and lent money freely because I believed in family the way some people believe in religion. My late husband George and I were not wealthy, but we were careful. We built something over decades of waking up early, spending less than we earned, and planning ahead for the years when our bodies would start slowing down. By the time George passed at the age of 81, we had a modest home paid off, a retirement account that was meant to carry me comfortably through my remaining years, and a deep sense of peace. I thought I had done everything right. I thought I had raised children who understood what we had sacrificed to get here. I thought the love I had poured into that family for 6 decades was sitting in a vault somewhere, waiting to be returned when I needed it most. I was wrong in ways that still take my breath away when I sit quietly enough to feel them. The changes did not come all at once. That is the thing people do not understand when they hear stories like mine from the outside. They imagine some dramatic moment, a confrontation, a discovery, a single event that flips everything upside down. But real betrayal is quieter than that. Real betrayal seeps in through the edges of ordinary days. It starts with your son Michael calling more frequently and asking more questions than usual about how you are managing on your own. It looks like concern. It sounds like love. He starts coming by on Saturdays and offering to pick up groceries, and one afternoon he sits at the kitchen table and gently, with a warm smile, suggests that it might just be easier if he helped oversee your finances. He uses words like simplify and protect, and at your age, Mom, it is just one less thing to worry about. And because you trust him, because this is the little boy whose forehead you kissed every night for 18 years, you say yes. You say yes, and you hand him a piece of yourself that you cannot take back, without a fight you are not prepared for. What research has since confirmed, what I know now in my bones, is that what happened to me has happened to millions of people who look exactly like me. Studies from major medical institutions have found that family members represent the single largest group of perpetrators in cases of financial exploitation of older adults. Not strangers. Not scammers calling from foreign numbers. Family. The people given power of attorney, the ones who volunteer to help manage accounts, the ones who offer to drive you to the bank. In one large-scale study, family members were found to be responsible for the majority of financial exploitation cases reported by older adults, accounting for more than half of all known perpetrators. And what is especially difficult to accept is that in many of these cases, the older adult sees it coming in some quiet part of themselves, but lacks the emotional language to name it, because naming it would mean dismantling something they have built their entire identity around. I was one of those people. I saw the edges of it and looked away, not because I was foolish, but because I was human. The first time I noticed something concrete was about 14 months after Michael took over managing my accounts. I had asked him a simple question about a certificate of deposit that George and I had held for nearly 2 decades. I remembered its approximate value because we had discussed it many times over the years and had always agreed that it was the last thing we would ever touch, the emergency cushion. Michael told me it had been cashed out due to a penalty fee situation that he had handled on my behalf. He had the paperwork ready. He showed it to me patiently. But the number on that paperwork was not right. The fee he described did not match what I knew about how those accounts worked. I had managed money long enough to know that something about the explanation was carefully constructed rather than simply true. I asked again. He smiled. He told me not to worry. He told me I was confused. And for a moment, sitting in my own kitchen in the house I had owned for 40 years, I wondered if maybe he was right. That moment of self-doubt, that brief collapse of trust in my own perception, is the most painful thing I carry from that whole experience. Not the money. The moment I almost let someone convince me I could not trust my own mind. There is something particular that happens to a person when they begin to suspect that a child is the source of their suffering. The grief is not simple. It does not move in a straight line toward anger or resolution. It circles back through every memory you have ever made with that person and asks you to re-examine all of it. Every birthday party, every phone call, every moment of tenderness suddenly sits under a new and terrible light. You find yourself wondering how long it was happening, how much was real, which conversations were genuine, and which were part of a strategy you never saw clearly enough. I spent weeks moving through my house with this kind of rearranging happening inside me, and the loneliness of it is something I cannot fully describe. I could not call my daughter Sandra because she and Michael had always been close, and I did not yet know where her loyalties truly sat. I could not call old friends because most of them were gone or too fragile for the weight of what I needed to say. I sat with it alone, the way old people are so often asked to sit with the hardest things. It was my neighbor Claudette who eventually gave me the push I needed. Claudette was 82 at the time, a sharp and practical woman who had spent her career as a paralegal and who had very little patience for sentimentality when it came to legal and financial matters. I had not told her what was happening, but she noticed a change in me over several weeks, and one afternoon came to my door with a pot of soup and a directness that I will always be grateful for. She asked me what was wrong. I told her some of it, carefully, watching her face. She did not look surprised. She told me she had seen this kind of thing before, more times than people would believe, and that the worst thing I could do was wait. She told me about adult protective services, and about legal advocates for seniors, and about the fact that financial exploitation of an older adult by a family member is not just morally wrong, it is a crime in every state. I had not let myself think of it in those terms yet. Hearing her say it out loud was like a window opening in a room that had been sealed for too long. I want to pause here and speak directly to anyone watching this who recognizes something in what I am saying. Not necessarily a situation as serious as mine, but that low-grade unease, that small persistent feeling that something in your family's financial dynamic is not quite right. That feeling deserves your attention. It is not disloyalty to investigate. It is not ingratitude to ask questions. One of the most damaging things that the culture of family privacy does to older adults is convince them that looking too closely at those they love is somehow a betrayal of trust, when in reality, protecting yourself is the most basic right you possess. You work for what you have. You built it. Whatever it looks like, however modest or significant, it belongs to you. Your children loving you does not entitle them to it. Your need for help does not cost you your right to know exactly what is happening with every dollar that is yours. After my conversation with Claudette, I spent 3 days gathering what I could. Old statements that I had kept in a shoebox in the back of my bedroom closet, because George had always insisted we keep paper records of everything. He used to say that paper does not lie even when people do, and those words came back to me with an almost unbearable force as I sat on the edge of my bed and went through 20 years of financial history. What I found over those 3 days painted a picture that was both worse and more clarifying than anything I had imagined. There were withdrawals I had not authorized. There were account transfers I had not been told about. There was a change on a beneficiary designation for one of my accounts that I had never signed, though there was a signature on the form with my name on it. I sat with those papers for a long time. Then I called a lawyer. The legal process that followed was one of the hardest things I have ever been through, and I say that as a woman who has buried a husband and survived a cancer diagnosis at the age of 77. The difficulty was not primarily the legal complexity, though that was considerable. The difficulty was human. It was the conversation I had to have with Sandra, who cried and then became defensive and then went quiet in a way that told me she had known more than she had admitted. It was Michael showing up at my door twice before the process concluded, once to apologize in a way that was really an explanation, and once to tell me that I was destroying the family over money, as though the family had not already been doing something quite serious to me. It was the days when I questioned myself again, when the old grooves of trust and love pulled at me and made me wonder whether I was being cruel to someone who was struggling. It was remembering what Claudette had said. It was George's shoebox of papers on the nightstand. It was choosing myself, over and over, on the days when that choice did not feel natural or easy. One of the things I was not prepared for, coming through the other side of all of this, was the strange quality of the clarity I found there. People assume that discovering a betrayal leaves you primarily in pain. And yes, the pain was real, and I will not minimize it. But there was also something else. There was a kind of release that came with finally seeing the situation plainly, without the fog of wishful thinking that I had been living in for years. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from knowing something is wrong and refusing to know it consciously at the same time. I had been carrying that exhaustion for longer than I realized, and when I finally put it down, even in the middle of grief and legal proceedings and sleepless nights, I could feel the difference in my body. I breathed differently. I stood differently. I stopped apologizing for things I had not done wrong. At 94, I am still learning what it means to take up the space that was always mine to take. I want to talk about loneliness, because I think it is the ground in which so many of these situations grow. Research on aging and vulnerability consistently points to social isolation as one of the primary factors that makes older adults susceptible to exploitation, and the cruelest dimension of that finding is that family-based exploitation often increases isolation deliberately. Looking back, I can see moments where Michael subtly discouraged certain friendships, framed certain relationships as unnecessary or draining, positioned himself as the most reliable person in my life, while quietly making that feel more true by reducing my other connections. It was not dramatic. It was small. A comment here about how so-and-so was probably just using me. A suggestion there that I did not need to go out as much, that he would take care of whatever I needed. Isolation is not always a locked door. Sometimes it is a series of gentle recommendations that add up over months and years to a life that has become much smaller than it used to be. After everything was resolved, as much as these things can be resolved, I made a decision that has changed the texture of my daily life completely. I decided that I was going to stop managing my emotional energy based on what other people needed me to feel. For decades, I had been the person who smoothed things over, who kept peace, who accepted explanations that did not fully satisfy me because the alternative felt too disruptive. I was the woman who let Michael tell me I was confused rather than trust the perfectly functional mind I had been using successfully for 9 decades. I was the woman who softened her own observations to protect someone else's comfort. That ended, not with bitterness, because I found that bitterness requires a kind of ongoing engagement with the source of your pain, and I no longer wanted to spend my energy that way. It ended with a simple, quiet decision to make myself the authority on my own experience. That sounds like a small thing. For a woman of my generation, it was revolutionary. I think about the women who will not have a Claudette, who will not have a shoebox, who will not have a lawyer they can call, or the physical and mental capacity to go through the process I went through. I think about them often, and it makes me want to be very specific about what I wish I had done differently in the years before things went wrong. The single most important thing I can say is this: do not wait for a problem to build financial literacy systems around yourself. Know exactly what you have. Keep your own records. Have at least one financial account that no one else can access. Establish a relationship with a financial advisor or attorney before you ever need one, so that person already knows you and your situation before any crisis arises. Have the kind of friendships where you can say hard things out loud, where you practice speaking discomfort before it becomes emergency. These are not pessimistic precautions. They are the basic infrastructure of a life lived on your own terms. There is a question I have been asked several times since I began sharing pieces of this story with people I trust, and I want to answer it honestly here. The question is whether I hate my son. The honest answer is no, and I have thought carefully about why. What I feel toward Michael is something closer to grief and distance. I grieve the version of him I believed in for so long. I maintain distance because trust, once broken in that particular way, does not simply reassemble because someone apologizes or because shared history gives you a reason to want it to. What I have learned about forgiveness in the last few years of my life is that it is entirely possible to release someone from your anger without reintroducing them into your life. Forgiveness is something you do for your own blood pressure, your own sleep, your own capacity to feel joy in the years you still have. It is not a promise to forget, and it is not an invitation back. Sandra and I have a relationship now that is different from anything we had before. It is smaller and more honest. She knows that I know things she would have preferred I never found out. I know that her version of loyalty was more complicated and more conditional than I had imagined. We meet for lunch twice a month. We talk about her children and her garden and things that carry no danger. We have, in an unspoken way, agreed to a version of each other that is manageable. I am not sure that is what love is supposed to look like. But at 94, I have made peace with the idea that life tends to give you the actual version of things rather than the version you planned on, and the actual version is still worth showing up for. I drink my tea at that lunch table. I look at my daughter's face. I find what is real in that room and I stay with it, and I let the rest go. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. Something that I find myself wanting to say to younger people watching this is that the seeds of what happened to me were planted long before I was old enough to be considered vulnerable. They were planted in the way I taught my children to relate to me, in the dynamics that I accepted and even encouraged over decades, in the moments where I prioritized harmony over honesty and kindness over clarity. I was never a pushover in the traditional sense. I was not weak or without opinion. But I had a habit of making myself available in ways that communicated, over time, that my needs were secondary to the needs of the people I loved. Children notice that, not consciously, not maliciously at first, but they internalize it. They come to expect a version of you that exists primarily in relation to them. And when you are older and more dependent and the world starts to feel smaller, that dynamic can calcify into something that looks like care but functions like control. I have come to believe that one of the greatest gifts you can give the people you love is a clear, consistent demonstration that you have a life that belongs to you, interests that have nothing to do with them, resources that are yours to decide about, opinions that do not bend to keep the peace, relationships outside of the family that matter to you and that you actively maintain. I say this not as a prescription for selfishness, but as a description of what genuine self-respect looks like in practice, and as an observation about how self-respect protects you. A person who clearly values and defends their own life sends a different signal to the world than a person who has organized their entire existence around being available and pleasing. At 94, I understand that I spent too many years in the second category, and the woman I have become in the last few years, the one who says no clearly, who asks follow-up questions, who trusts her own perception first, is someone I wish I had become 40 years earlier. The house still stands. The garden I started tending more seriously after everything happened is remarkable this year. I have tomatoes and zinnias and a climbing rose that George planted in 1983 and that has outlived almost everyone who ever admired it. I have a small group of women I meet with on Thursday mornings, ranging in age from 67 to 88, and we talk about everything. We talk about our health and our money and our adult children and our fears and our small daily pleasures. And no one pretends that things are fine when they are not. That group has been more sustaining in the last 3 years than anything else in my life. And I want that for every woman sitting alone somewhere right now who has decided that her particular story is too complicated or too embarrassing or too painful to bring into the light. It is not. The light is where it heals. I will be honest with you about one more thing before I finish. There are days when the sadness of all of it sits very close. Not the anger, not the grief exactly, just a kind of quiet sorrow for the life I might have had if I had learned earlier what I know now. If I had understood sooner that love does not ask you to be confused, that care does not make you feel smaller, that the people who are truly on your side do not need your silence to feel secure. Those days come, and I let them. I make my tea. I sit in the garden if the weather allows. I think about George and about Claudette, and about the Thursday morning women, and about everything I have built in the years since I stopped pretending. And then the day opens up again, the way days do, full of ordinary things that are secretly extraordinary, and I am here for all of it. 94 years old, clear-eyed, still standing, still mine.